This is a production of World Video Bible School. To God be the glory.
In the last chapter, chapter 20, it almost sounded as if there were almost no manuscripts for the Old Testament. And we did talk about a lot of manuscripts in the New Testament. In chapter 21, you need to be turning there if you're not already there, page 357 in your textbook. We're going to be looking at the Old Testament manuscripts, and I believe that you'll find that there are lots of Old Testament manuscripts as well as a lot of other evidence for the Old Testament. So if you're there on page 357, starting about the second paragraph, the question that we really are going to try to answer in this chapter is, does this Hebrew text that we use today to translate all of our Bibles from, which we call Masoretic, that's the main text, faithfully represent the Hebrew text as originally written by the authors of the Old Testament books? Well, I can tell you the answer is yes. But you could tell somebody the answer is yes, but would you know why? Could you tell them anything else besides, yes, it does? So this chapter is designed to do that. Let's look at the first section in this chapter. Number 1, the number of Hebrew Old Testament manuscripts. It is a phenomenal number. And when you're looking at this paragraph, I would like for you to add just a word so that you kind of get the idea more correctly. He says the first collection of Hebrew manuscripts made by Benjamin Kennicott in 1776 to 1780. Why don't you, right after the word first, write the word modern? Just put that in your text there. And then it'll be a little more correct because it'll be the first modern collection of Hebrew manuscripts. Obviously, Hebrew manuscripts had been collected throughout the centuries, or Mr. Kennicott would not have been able to find any. And it was published by Oxford, the English school, and he listed 615 manuscripts of the Old Testament. However, just a couple of decades later, there were a list of 731. And then, in more recent times, Cairo Geniza in 1890 and the few years following that, and the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1947 and the few years following that, added tens of thousands of manuscripts. And if you'll notice, in the Cairo Synagogue attic storeroom, and we're going to define Geniza in a little while and talk about it so that you'll know what that word means, but there were 200,000 manuscripts and fragments, and 10,000 of them approximately were biblical manuscripts. Now let me, so that you understand what he's talking about here, when we say manuscript, probably in your mind, or at least in some people's minds, they would think, oh, an entire book, 10,000 copies of Exodus and Leviticus and so on. No, it would be maybe a piece of manuscript this big, or it could be an entire book. Anything that has biblical writing on it, regardless of how small or how large or long, is called a manuscript. And so that'll help the definition. In the last phrase, or the last sentence of the page there, it says, Moshe Goshen Gottstein estimates that the total number of Old Testament Hebrew manuscript fragments throughout the world runs into the tens of thousands. That's a little different than it sounded in the last chapter, isn't it? But you have to start somewhere. You have to start back with, here are some, and here are some, and here's what they did, and here's who did it. Now let's look at some of these manuscripts. And by the way, as we go through this chapter, some of the things I'm literally going to read the entire paragraph to you. Some things we're going to skip almost the whole pages. And so I've tried to pick out, I've gone through this kind of material for years, and it's very difficult to not read some of these word for word. And on the other hand, unless you're really intending to work in a specific area of scholarship, some of the material in here is just for you to know about, and you would have to, if you were going to be a scholar in the area, have to go back and delve deeply into it anyway, instead of just know the name of it and where it was found and what date. So I'll try to make this in the way that I think, anyway, gives us the most information we need now, and then of course you're able to go into whatever other areas you want to and deal as deeply as you want to. Let's look at number A. Major collections of Old Testament manuscripts. Now, this is not all collections, this is just the major collections. And I can't do anything almost except read this paragraph, so read with me. Of the 200,000 Cairo Geniza manuscript fragments, some 100,000 are housed at Cambridge University in England. The largest organized collection of Hebrew Old Testament manuscripts in the world is the Second Furkowich. Now, Furkowich is the name of a town that's up in the northwest corner of the Soviet Union, and it's called the Furkowich Collection in Leningrad, over in Russia. It contains 1,582 items of the Bible and Masorah. Now look at that word just a minute. We're going to be running onto that word many, many times, so you might as well just put a definition out by the side of it. That definition would be, and you could just write it right above it if you want to, tradition. Tradition. That's a Hebrew word that means tradition. 1,582 items of the Bible and the Masorah, which is the collection of traditions of the Jews. You remember Jesus was against these traditions because they were being taught instead of God's Word. On parchment, 725 of those were on paper. 1,200 additional manuscript fragments. In the British Museum in England, there is 161 Hebrew Old Testament manuscripts. At Oxford, the Bodleian Library Catalog has 146 Old Testament manuscripts, and each one of them has a number of fragments which are put together somewhat like a jigsaw puzzle. Goshen Gottstein estimates that in the U.S. alone there are tens of thousands of Semitic, remember the word Semitic, manuscripts, and about 5% of those are biblical, which means in the U.S. there are about 500. So in the world there are tens of thousands of manuscripts, from small to complete, of the Old Testament. Now let's go to the next section, the description of the major Old Testament manuscripts. To begin with, I think, before we get into this section, I'd like to share some information that Brother Lightfoot put in his book, How We Got the Bible, because the first question that we sometimes have is, why are the manuscripts so late? Why don't we have something from Moses' time of the law? And why don't we have something of David's time, and so on? Let me read the quotation here. One may wonder why copies of the Hebrew Bible are late in comparison with the New Testament materials, and especially when it is recalled that the Old Testament was completed several centuries before the very first New Testament book was written. The answer is not difficult to find. The Jewish scribes looked, and listen carefully to this part, the Jewish scribes looked upon their copies of Scripture with almost superstitious respect, which led them to give a ceremonial burial to any copy which was old or became worn. Now you see, that means that even though that copy might have stayed around for hundreds of years, not when they dug a hole in the ground and put it in there, it began to deteriorate. And then he goes ahead to say, their motive was to prevent the improper use of the material on which the sacred name of God had been inscribed. So their view was that when they had a book of the Bible, it was almost holy itself. I don't mean that it was not the holy Word of God, but I mean that even the material it was on and so on was holy. Nor did they want their enemies to take it out, change it up, make it read the way that it didn't read, and pass it off as though it had come from God. So they went out and, for the most part, destroyed their old copies. that made it very difficult for us. They were trying to do something good, but it didn't help us in some ways. Other ways it did, and we'll show you that a little bit later on. Let's look quickly at some of the major Old Testament manuscripts then. The first one is the Nash Papyrus. And this is 1,000 years older than most of the Old Testament manuscripts that we use for translating the Bible, the Masoretic text. It's about 1,000 years older than that, and it has just one damaged copy of the Shema. Now the Shema was the statement in Deuteronomy 6 verses 4 to 9, or especially part of it, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one God." Well, and then two fragments of the Ten Commandments. And it's dated between the 2nd century BC and the 1st century AD. And by the way, it is very similar to the Masoretic text, like what said 1,000 years older. And they can tell the difference in the way the words are spelled and so on, as we've already talked about. Number 2 is Orientalis 4445. This is in the British Museum, and it's dated by Ginsburg between 820 and 850 AD. And look, you see they have the word the Masorah there again. So the tradition notes, the Jews, the scribes, would put in what the tradition about the particular teaching or what the Jews were to do about this particular things were added a century later, right in the text or right alongside the text. They also had the added vowel points, and they are from the time of Moses ben Asher. Now you're going to read his name a lot when you study about Old Testament manuscripts. He is from the 10th century AD. This is not Moses, the one who led Israel out of Egypt and so on. But Moses ben Asher, a Jewish, well-known Jewish scribe and scholar of that period of time. And then if you'll go down to number 3 at the bottom, you have Codex. Codex, remember, means book form. Codex Cariensis, and it has a colophon in it. That's the word at the bottom of the page, and it defines that for you. A colophon is when the author, or pardon me, the one who was copying this, would write at the end who did it, or perhaps sometimes the date that he did it. And in this particular case, he actually put the colophon in there, and it was the Cairo Codex. It was written and vowel pointed in AD 895 by Moses ben Asher in Tiberias in Palestine, out there by the Sea of Galilee. It contains, in the Old Testament, remember the way that the books were named, former prophets, latter prophets, and so on? Well, the former prophets and the latter prophets, and it is, with all the manuscripts, they have given them just an abbreviated name, and this one is symbolized by the letter C. So if you see that in a footnote sometime, if there's a variant reading in your Bible and it has a footnote C, that would mean that it's from Codex Cariensis. Number 4 is the Aleppo Codex. Now this is the oldest complete Old Testament manuscript. That would be on a test. The oldest complete Old Testament manuscript, it dates from 930 A.D. Now remember these AD dates, because in just a little bit we're going to go back BC. And down at the bottom of that paragraph, it has been photographed and was planned to be the basis of the new Hebrew Bible that was going to be published by the Hebrew University. That I'm not sure if it has already come out or not. The book was published in 1986, and I'm not sure if they completed that in the next few years. Then in Codex Leningradinus, according to a colophon, again, this is where the guy writes something at the end of the book, or a note at the end. This was copied in Old Cairo by Samuel ben Jacob in 1008. And if you'll jump down 2 lines, you notice it represents one of the oldest manuscripts of the complete Hebrew Bible that is known. So here we have 2 complete, every book, every word, from beginning to end, going back to 930 AD and 1008 A.D. Number 6 is Babylonian Codex of the Latter Prophets. This is from the year 916 A.D. and it was had some punctuation in it. And we talked in the last chapter about punctuation. We'll tell you something about the date. But notice that it is by the Babylonian school of the Masoretes. Now, the Masoretes normally were in Tiberias, there on the Sea of Galilee. But let me read to you a little bit. This is kind of a long quote here from Kenyon. You've seen Kenyon quoted throughout this Geisler Nick's book. He's a great scholar in this area. But listen why it's called the Babylonian school of the Masoretes. As a consequence of the Second Jewish Revolt, and I don't know if you knew they were kicked out of Jerusalem twice or not, but in 135 A.D., they were also run out of Jerusalem again. You remember 70 A.D., of course, the one that Jesus was talking about. But they came back in about 60 years later, 50 years later, and stayed until 135. So in the Second Jewish Revolt and the spread of Christianity, the center of rabbinical studies moved from Palestine to Babylonia. And in the schools, first at some of the towns over there, flourished until the 9th century and later. But when the Muslims conquered Palestine in 638, they actually made it possible for Jewish life and culture to go back to Palestine, and the academy at Tiberias became especially famous as the headquarters of biblical learning then. It was in these schools during this period of time, after they moved back to Tiberias, both the Eastern and the Western, that the Babylonian and the Palestinian Talmuds and our Aramaic Targums were composed and put into final shape. But most important of all, it was at Tiberias that the text of the Old Testament, which we find in Hebrew manuscripts from the 9th century and in our present Hebrew Bibles, was finally fixed and standardized. It is that which is called the Masoretic text. So the one that we're reading about here is, in this Babylonian Codex, that's even before the Masoretic text. And so we have that. Goes back just a little bit, about 916, a little bit earlier than the others. And then you have the Reuchlin Codex of the Prophets. Then you have the Cairo-Geniza manuscripts. And I have a definition, or you have a definition here in your textbook, what a Geniza was. But let me read a little bit more detail about it. It was not just really a little storehouse that somebody built out at the side of a synagogue or something. In Kenyon's book, he says, attached to each synagogue was a Geniza. Now the Hebrew word means to hide something. A sort of lumber room or cupboard in which worn or defective manuscripts, or indeed any other documents containing the divine name, remember what we talked about the divine name, were laid aside. Thus, far from regarding an older copy of the Scripture as more valuable, the Jewish habit had been to prefer the newer as being the more perfect and free from damage. Now, if you'll think about that a minute, you'll see why that was true. Because back in those days, they had scrolls. So you had the writing on one side, and you would roll that up, then you'd roll it back, and then you would roll it up, and you'd roll it back. And, of course, your hands were always there, and they were touching part of the place where the print would be, and the movement of the whatever it was written on, probably the skins, would, after a while, get where you could hardly tell what Hebrew letter this was. So the newer the scroll, and remember how they copied them very, very, very precisely, the newer the scroll was better. So they thought the old ones were not valuable. So the older copies, once consigned to the Geniza, where they would be saved from profanation, that's his word there, meaning nobody would profane it and take it out and change it, were left until the room or cupboard was full. Then they would remove those and bury them in the ground in an elaborate ceremony, and which time they would start then to decay And therefore we've had fewer manuscripts than we would otherwise have had. But we have here at the bottom of page 359 the Cairo Geniza manuscripts, and you'll notice that there are about 10,000 of biblical manuscripts and fragments and scattered around the world. And you can read, I think, the rest of these, look at those, and then notice on page 360 the Erfurt codices. Excuse me. They're listed in the university library at Tübingen. Now, Tübingen in Germany is one of the most liberal universities, theological universities in the world. Much of the false teaching about the Bible itself has come from this very place. And yet they have some of the codices of the Old Testament. And then you have some lost codices. It says, there are a number of significant but now lost codices whose peculiar readings are preserved and referred to in Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia. Now, what that means is that we have evidence of them. We know they used to exist. We have quotations from them, or we have people quoting them that referred to them, and they'll be referenced in a collection, but we do not have access to them. We do not know where they now are. So, yes, there are very many Old Testament manuscripts. We're not just looking at one or two or three and saying, oh yes, it's really clear that we have the accurate Old Testament. We have thousands of pieces of evidence. But let's look at point number 2. We have now the Dead Sea Scrolls. And I think that sometimes people, when they hear the Dead Sea Scrolls, especially if they watch the newscasts and if they watch the newspapers and the magazines and the books and so on, they're a little afraid of the Dead Sea Scrolls, that something is going to come up. I've got a book here. It's called From the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Nag Hammadi Discoveries, The Lost Years of Jesus Revealed. By the way, this is the revised edition. I don't know exactly how that would work out. But folks, first of all, there are no lost years of Jesus. The things that are in this book have been known ever since they were written, and Christians knew who wrote them and rejected them. These were written by people called Gnostics. They were a sect that had some areas of Christianity in it, but they were even denying that Jesus was who he was, and they didn't even believe that God the Father was really the God of the universe. And so people are a little bit afraid of that. But we have newspaper articles, and here's one that says, Dead Sea Scrolls Importance Debated. Well, the reason why I keep this one is because this came out in 1977. Now, if you have been, this is 1997, 20 years later that I'm doing this, and just recently, in the last year and a half or so, there's been a great hassle about the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they've been released now to everyone, and they're going to find out about how Christianity started in Jesus' life and all this. That stuff was not new. 20 years ago, here's one of the things. A theory that Jesus may have lived among the monk-like Essenes, not monkey, but like Catholic monks, among the monk-like Essenes before the teaching ministry described in the New Testament doesn't have any acceptance in the scholarly community. These people have known what the Dead Sea Scrolls said. There weren't any secrets that were revealed a year or two ago, but that came out in all the newspapers, and it just sounded like it. Really, one of the fine books on this is this one here. The man who was over in Palestine as an archaeologist and a scholar that got to see, one of the very first ones to see the Dead Sea Scrolls was the man who wrote this book, John C. Trevor. As a matter of fact, the name of this is The Dead Sea Scrolls, A Personal Account, and by John Trevor. And of course, he was a young man at the time, and he has a few photographs in there of places where it happened and so on, and we'll be talking about that in a little while. But you can certainly read about the Dead Sea Scrolls, and you do not have to be afraid of whatever comes out about it. in the Biblical Archaeological Review, or Archaeology Review, which is a quarterly magazine on archaeology, biblical archaeology, as fairly obvious from the title, I guess. There is an article in the back, or in one part of it, that says, "Did Jesus really die on the cross?" And here's what it's about. Jesus and the riddle of the Dead Sea Scrolls, unlocking the secrets of his life story, by Barbara Thiering. And this was printed in San Francisco in 1992, cost $24, 451 pages, and after this person reviewed it, here's what he said. "The real mystery is how Harper," which is the publishing company, San Francisco, a division of HarperCollins that is generally known for books of solid scholarship, decided to publish this volume. The answer doubtless has something to do with what was on the tables that Jesus overturned. The publisher has told the bookstores that it's going to spend $30,000 promoting the book, so they had better stock it. This kind of thing does not have any validity at all in scholarly journals. It's just a way to make money and scare people to make them think that, oh, the Bible is not complete. I guess I better find out about the lost books or something secret in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Don't worry about it, please. Let's look to see what the Dead Sea Scrolls really are for. First, at the bottom of page 360, it is so significant for us to realize that every Old Testament book has been found in whole or in part in the Dead Sea Scrolls, except the book of Esther. Not only that, by the way, but there are found commentaries on every Old Testament book except the book of Esther, which shows the significance that these books had. And guess what? There is not a commentary that has been found on any of the so-called apocryphal books. You see, the Jews knew that the apocryphal books were not from God. They were from man. You don't write commentaries when you're in the field of religion on books written by man. You write commentaries on books written by God. And so there's just another proof that we have the right books in our Bible, and those who add other books are not using the ones that ought to be there. But let me read to you again from Kenyon's book, Our Bible and the Ancient Manuscripts, this time from page 36, about the importance of the Dead Sea Scrolls. He says, "In this respect, they are of the very greatest importance and enable us, as has been said, to penetrate the Masoretic barrier by centuries." I'll sort of explain that in a minute if you didn't understand what he was talking about. But apart from that, these unexpected finds show us what ancient Hebrew scrolls looked like, the form of the script, the conventions of the scribes, and the pronunciation of the Hebrew language around the beginning of the Christian era. Previously, much of this had been a matter of conjecture. It is now possible to fill in many gaps and also to hope that further discoveries of the same kind will be made where previously they had been unlooked for. Well, at the top of page 361, after we have understood that these are one of the major discoveries, let's go back and look a little bit at how they happened. So let's look at a discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, I'd like for you to look at this picture that we're going to be showing of the area where the Dead Sea Scrolls came from. It's called Khirbet Qumran. That means the community of Qumran. And then the Wadi, which is the thing is a sort of like a dry riverbed, Qumran. And we're looking here from the cliffs out to the west, and you can see the Dead Sea in the background. Now, the significance of this area is that it's very isolated. You can see that at least now, and not much different from 45 years or 50 years ago, that it's a very desolate area. But the story is that there was an Arab shepherd boy, whose name, by the way, was Muhammad ad-Dib, and he was pursuing a lost goat. And he was about 7.5 miles south of Jericho, which is in the area there where you're seeing on the screen. And he apparently threw a rock over into one of the caves there, and he found some jars. He heard something break. He went over there and found some jars, and they contained leather scrolls. Well, after a number of others came in and explored them, then they discovered all these scrolls of the Dead Sea. Well, we're going to be talking about those in a little bit, but I'd like right now just to note for you some of the things that are so significant about them that even the early writers knew about this area. Pliny, who was an ancient writer, a Roman writer of the latter part of the 1st century, between 73 and 79, gave an account of the Essenes. Everyone knew that they existed. He wrote a book called Natural History, and he includes information about them. It says, on the Dead Sea's west side, just far enough from its shore to avoid its baneful influences, live the Essenes. They form a solitary community, and they inspire our admiration more than any other community in the whole world. They live without women, for they have renounced all sexual life. They live without money, and without any company save that of the palm trees. From day to day their numbers are maintained by the streams of people who seek them out and join them from far and wide. These people are driven to adopt the Essenes' way of life through weariness of ordinary life and by reason of the changes of fortune. Thus, this community in which no one is ever born continues without dying. Other people's weariness of life is the secret of their adding fertility, and palm groves formerly made it second only to Jerusalem. But now, like Jerusalem itself, it lies in a heap of ashes. Now remember, this was written between 73 and 79 AD, after the destruction of Jerusalem. Well, so was Qumran destroyed in some period of time about the same time Jerusalem was. By the way, this is from a book by F.F. Bruce on Thoughts on the Dead Sea Scrolls. An excellent book, by the way. Well, let's look down at number B, the description of the Dead Sea Scroll discoveries. The very first one is another one that I want to show you a picture of. It is St. Mark's Monastery Isaiah Scroll, and this is perhaps the most famous of the scrolls that we have found in the Dead Sea. This picture of it here, you're not able to see the printing on it very clearly, but it is an excellent hand. You can see that it is quite well preserved. On the sides, you can see where the hands that have over the years and maybe even longer rolled it back and rolled it up and rolled it back. The book of Isaiah, you remember, is the book that Jesus quoted from or read from in the synagogue, and the record that we have of his being there and then teaching them that a certain portion of Isaiah was fulfilled in their hearing. And so this Isaiah is called Isaiah A, and that is the first one that they found. And it's a popular copy with numerous corrections above the line or in the margin, and is the earliest known copy of any complete book of the Bible. It's just been a great blessing that the Lord has allowed us to discover these things. We'll talk about more significance in a little bit. But there are also other things in the caves that were found. If you'll look at the Manual of Discipline, the commentary on the book of Habakkuk, Genesis Apocryphon, and I might note for you that some of these things were based upon their ideas about religion. And concerning the Genesis Apocryphon, it has recently been treated a different way. Up till the time of being able to read manuscripts with infrared light, this particular book only had about 1,000. You could only read about 1,000. This is not a book in the Bible. This is not the Genesis of the Bible. This is one of their writings about Genesis. And it is, they only had about 1,000 words that we could read, but because of new scholarly work that NASA was able to come up with from a jet propulsion laboratory in California, they were able to read another 200 words through infrared. And this is just a recent thing, 1995. They were able to do that. Then you see the Hebrew University Isaiah. It is not complete like Isaiah A is, but it agrees more closely with the Masoretic text than Isaiah A does. Then you have a War Scroll, and on the War Scroll, according to Nelson's Illustrated Bible Dictionary, he says it's a collection of plans for the final battle between the, quote, sons of light and, quote, the sons of darkness, or between the army of God and the army of Belial. Such information as that of religious offices during wartime, recruitment, the sequence of campaigns, and the order of deploying battle squadrons is included. By the way, if you're really interested in what is contained in all of the things in the Dead Sea Scrolls, nearly everything that they have has been translated into English. You're able to buy books of it and read whatever you want to, especially all the more important things. I was in the British Museum at one time, and they had a box about this big, about this long, about this deep, and it was totally filled with little bitty pieces of broken up, probably papyri. It may have been vellum or parchment, but it was manuscripts. Who knew what was in there? And now that was very difficult for people to do, because they literally put these things out all on tables, and someone would try to recognize 2 or 3 letters and try to figure out what word that would be, and then try to find out what book that would go in. And then they would bring it down here at this end of the table, and we're talking a very long room with tables all the way down the middle. Under glass, these things would be, and then they'd move it over there, and they'd try to put these together. Well, guess what? Now that they have computers, they're able to size these things up, run through maybe 1,000 different possibilities in a little bit, and they're able to put these together with much better ability than they've ever had before. And I'm sure that we'll be discovering other information from there, but we're not worried about it. As we've already pointed out, there's not going to be anything in there against God or against the Bible that's true and authentic. At the bottom of page 362, you'll see that Cave 1 had fragments of Genesis, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, Judges, Samuel, Isaiah, Ezekiel, Psalms, and then some other writings that were not biblical. In Cave 2, if you'll go down to the 3rd line, you'll see it included some manuscripts of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Jeremiah, Job, Psalms, Ruth. And then Cave 3, there were no biblical manuscripts found. In Cave 4 was the most productive. And you will note that literally thousands of fragments were recovered either by purchase from the Bedouin who had been in there before them, or by sifting the sand literally in the floor and getting the sand out, and then taking the fragments that were the scraps that were left. And there were about 100 copies of Bible books. Every book except Esther, in whole or in part, was found in this cave. Then if you'll go down to the bottom 3 lines of that paragraph, it says, an interesting fragment containing some of Daniel 7:28 and 8:1, where the language changes back from Aramaic, and if you were with us a couple of chapters ago, you know what we're talking about there, to Hebrew was found. If you go to the very top line of that same page, 363, you'll notice in Cave 1 an interesting fragment of Daniel containing 2:4, where the language changes from Hebrew to Aramaic was found. And so this Aramaic change was not something new. This goes way back there. It was not done after people started in the 2nd century or 3rd century or whatever using Aramaic in the Christian world. Then Cave 5, there were some biblical books. Cave 6, on the next page you'll see, had little pieces of Daniel, 1st and 2nd Kings. Caves 7 through 10, there were no things that were relevant to textual criticism of the Bible. And then in Cave 11, you will look and see that there were things from Psalms, including the apocryphal Psalm 151. Now, the only place we'd had that before was in the Greek version of the Old Testament, the Septuagint. But they found it in that cave. And then they found some other Psalms 93 through 150. And then a part of Leviticus was found there. So those are the things that were found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And let's go a little bit further. This next thing at the bottom of the page is also significant because it helped in some other areas. But Muraba'at is the way that you would say that. The little comma is like you pause and then say the rest of the word. Discoveries. Prompted by the original finds, the Bedouin have pursued their search and found caves to the southeast of Bethlehem, which have produced self-dated manuscripts. There's the key to what this is important for. And documents from the Second Jewish Revolt. Systematic exploration and excavation of these caves began in 52. The dated manuscripts proved to be later Old Testament, and helped to establish the antiquity of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And here's why. From these caves came another scroll of the Minor Prophets, which closely supports the Masoretic text. The oldest known Semitic papyrus was a palimpsest, you remember what that means, one that had been erased and written over, inscribed the second time in the ancient Hebrew script dating from the 7th to 8th centuries B.C. And it was found here. And if you look at your footnote, in your footnote 31, at the bottom of the page, another site known as Khirbet Mird has produced manuscript materials. On April 3rd, 1960, a parchment fragment of Psalm 15 and part of Psalm 16 was discovered at Wadi Muraba'at. And so it was a very significant thing. Then back up to the text where we stopped. As can readily be seen, there's now a mass of material of the Old Testament text, more than scholars will be able to absorb in some decades. And truly, they're continuing to study and put this together. Much of this material has already been published, and like I said earlier, here down in footnote 32 is one of the books where the Dead Sea Scrolls have been translated into English. If you want to read them, you can on your own. But much more from caves 4 and 11 still remain to be published. So, in this area, we have seen, first of all, that there are many Hebrew, old manuscripts, some totally complete. But they came at about 1000 A.D., 900 to 1000 A.D. Old little pieces were before that, much older. But then the Dead Sea Scrolls came. And in our next lesson, we'll begin looking at the way that you date the Dead Sea Scrolls and what age they really were.